December 1944. Camp Ellis, Illinois. The frozen prairie wind cut through the rows of wooden barracks where 3,000 German prisoners of war waited out the winter, convinced they had been captured by a nation that barely understood the meaning of industrial civilization. They had seen the American soldiers, farm boys who couldn't pronounce German names, who ate strange food from tin cans, who seemed to know nothing of European culture or military tradition. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, formerly of the 1st Parachute Division, had written in his diary that the Americans were technologically fortunate but culturally primitive. He would soon discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to witness would shatter every assumption they held about the nation that had defeated them, revealing an industrial and architectural achievement so overwhelming that some would refuse to believe their own eyes. Camp Ellis sprawled across 7,000 acres of Illinois farmland, hastily constructed in 1942 to house the flood of German and Italian prisoners arriving from North Africa and Europe. The prisoners lived in relative comfort, far better conditions than many American citizens in Depression-era poverty, but comfort wasn't what occupied their thoughts. Weber and his fellow officers spent their days analyzing everything they observed, trying to understand the nation that had somehow turned the tide of the entire conflict. Sergeant Hans Müller, a tank commander captured in France, had been carefully documenting American industrial capacity based on what he could observe. The tin cans alone fascinated him, millions upon millions of them, each one perfectly sealed, containing food that somehow remained fresh for months. He calculated that producing such containers required more metal than the entire output of some European factories. Yet the Americans threw them away after a single use. Then there was Captain Ernst Richter, an engineer who had designed fortifications along the Atlantic coast. He noticed the trucks, endless convoys of them, all identical, rolling past the camp with mechanical precision. He counted makes and models, Dodge, Chevrolet, GMC, Ford, and realized with growing unease that America was producing more vehicles in a month than his homeland could manufacture in a year. And these were just the trucks he could see from one small camp in the middle of nowhere. The prisoners received American magazines, carefully censored but still revealing. Life, the Saturday Evening Post, Popular Mechanics. The images showed factories that seemed impossible, assembly lines stretching farther than entire German industrial complexes, warehouses that could swallow cathedrals, ships being launched at a rate that defied mathematical probability. Many prisoners assumed these were propaganda fabrications, American boasting designed to demoralize them. Weber wrote in his diary, "They show us pictures of their cities, claiming buildings of incredible height. We know this is exaggeration. No structure could reach such heights and remain standing. They think we are fools who will believe anything." But in January 1945, everything changed. Colonel Harrison McKinley, the camp commander, made an unusual announcement. A group of prisoners, selected for good behavior and cooperation, would be taken on an educational excursion. They would travel north to Chicago, where they would see how American civilians lived and worked. The stated purpose was to demonstrate that America had no interest in destroying German culture, only in ending the conflict. Weber was among those selected, along with Müller, Richter, and 43 other prisoners. They boarded a train on a bitter cold morning, guarded by young American soldiers who seemed more interested in playing cards than maintaining military discipline. The journey took several hours through landscape that looked remarkably similar to northern Germany. Frozen fields, small towns, farms dusted with snow. Müller watched through the frosted window, counting rail lines. He had been a railway engineer before the conflict and understood logistics intimately. What he observed troubled him deeply. The tracks they traveled on were welded rail, relatively new, and the roadbed was perfectly maintained. Every few miles they passed another train, freight carriers loaded with steel, coal, timber, manufactured goods. The volume of traffic was staggering. He leaned toward Weber and spoke quietly. "If this single rail line carries this much material, and America has thousands of miles of track, the production capacity would be..." He trailed off, unable to complete the calculation. Propaganda, Weber replied, but his voice carried less certainty than before. They route us along their busiest corridor to impress us. The train slowed as they approached the outskirts of Chicago. Richter, the engineer, pressed his face against the cold glass. He saw factories, real ones, not photographs that could be manipulated. Smokestacks by the dozens, buildings that stretched for city blocks, rail yards where hundreds of freight cars sat waiting to be loaded. He had designed fortifications meant to stop an enemy with this kind of industrial base. The futility of that effort suddenly became apparent. Then the city itself came into view, and the conversation in the prisoner car ceased entirely. The Americans had not been lying. The photographs had not been exaggerated. If anything, they had failed to capture the true scale of what rose before them. Chicago's skyline materialized through the winter haze like something from an impossible dream. The Board of Trade building, the Civic Opera House, the Tribune Tower, the Wrigley building, structures of steel and stone reaching heights that simply should not have been achievable. Weber's hands began to shake. He had seen Berlin, Vienna, Paris, Rome. He had stood in squares surrounded by architecture that represented centuries of European achievement. This was different. This wasn't architecture built to commemorate the past. This was architecture that announced the future. The train pulled into Union Station, and the prisoners disembarked under guard. They walked through the great hall with its soaring ceilings and classical columns, then emerged onto Canal Street. The sound hit them first, the roar of traffic, the clatter of streetcars, the deep bass notes of steam whistles from the Chicago River. Then the sheer density of humanity, thousands of people moving with purpose through the January cold, all of them dressed better than many European citizens in peacetime. Private James Sullivan, one of the guards, noticed the prisoners had gone silent. He had grown up in Chicago and found nothing remarkable about his city, but watching these men, enemy soldiers who had fought with courage and skill, standing paralyzed with their mouths open, he began to see his home through different eyes. "That's the Board of Trade," he said, pointing to the towering structure at the end of LaSalle Street. 45 stories, built in 1930 during the Depression when things were supposedly bad here. Weber did the conversion in his head. 45 stories, more than 140 meters tall. The building wasn't just tall, it was massive at its base, solid, permanent, and it was just one of dozens of similar structures. The prisoners were loaded onto buses for a tour of the city. The route had been carefully planned to showcase American civilian achievement. They drove down Michigan Avenue, where department stores displayed consumer goods in quantities that seemed obscene. Sullivan pointed out Marshall Field's, explaining it was just one of several major retailers in the city. "How many people live here?" Muller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About 3.5 million in the city proper," Sullivan replied. "Maybe 4.5 million in the greater metropolitan area." Muller's mind reeled. 3.5 million people, all of them apparently fed, clothed, housed, and employed. The logistics required to supply such a population, the food, water, electricity, transportation, represented an organizational achievement that dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. They drove through the Loop, where the elevated trains rattled overhead and office workers hurried between buildings. Richter kept turning his head, trying to count the structures, trying to understand the engineering principles that made such density possible. Steel frame construction, he realized. These buildings didn't rely on load-bearing walls. They were essentially skeletons of steel with skin stretched over them. The technique wasn't unknown in Europe, but the Americans had perfected it and deployed it at a scale that transformed entire cities. The bus stopped at the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and the prisoners were allowed to disembark and stand at the railing. Below them, the Chicago River flowed backwards, an engineering project that had reversed the river's flow to protect Lake Michigan from pollution. Sullivan explained this casually, as though reversing a river was a routine civic improvement project. But it was the buildings that held their attention. The Wrigley building gleamed white even in the gray winter light, its clock tower a perfect imitation of European design, but executed with American boldness. Across the river, the Tribune Tower rose in Gothic splendor, its flying buttresses and peaked crown purely decorative, structure serving no purpose except to announce excellence. Weber finally found his voice. "When was this built?" 1925, Sullivan replied. Won a design competition. The Tribune is a newspaper. One newspaper built this. One newspaper. The implications settled over the prisoners like a physical weight. This structure, which would have been the pride of any European capital, had been commissioned by a single private company to house its offices. Not a government ministry, not a royal palace, a newspaper. They reboarded the buses and continued south, where the tour guides pointed out the Field Museum, Soldier Field, and the Shed Aquarium, massive civic projects built during the economic depression of the 1930s. The Americans had been so wealthy during their worst economic crisis that they constructed buildings of monumental scale purely for education and entertainment. Muller leaned close to Weber. "I need to revise my estimates," he said quietly. "Everything I calculated about American production capacity was wrong. I was off by orders of magnitude." "It's one city," Weber replied, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "It's not just one city," Richter interjected. He had been silent for most of the tour, his engineer's mind processing what he observed. Sullivan mentioned New York is larger. He mentioned other cities, Philadelphia, Detroit, Los Angeles. If this is typical of American urban development. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The buses turned west, heading toward the industrial district. If the Skyline had shaken them, what they saw next completed the transformation of their understanding. The stockyards came first. Sullivan explained that Chicago processed more meat than any other city in the world, that the techniques developed here, assembly line butchering, had been adapted by manufacturers worldwide. The prisoners saw buildings stretching for blocks, rail lines carrying livestock from across the entire continent, refrigerated warehouses holding enough food to feed millions. Then they reached the steel mills along the lakefront. Even from a distance, the scale was incomprehensible. These weren't workshops or small factories. These were industrial complexes that consumed entire neighborhoods. Smoke poured from dozens of stacks, rail lines crisscrossed in complex junctions, and the orange glow of blast furnaces lit the winter sky. Sullivan mentioned almost casually that these mills produced millions of tons of steel annually, that they operated continuously, that America had dozens of similar facilities. Captain Richter stood at the bus window, his face pressed against the cold glass, and he wept. He made no sound, but tears ran freely down his cheeks. Muller noticed and put a hand on his shoulder. "What is it?" Muller asked. "I designed the Atlantic fortifications," Richter said, his voice breaking. "Concrete bunkers, steel doors, gun emplacements. I calculated how much firepower would be required to breach them. I based my calculations on European industrial capacity." He gestured toward the mills. "This is the industry that came for us. This is what we were fighting. We never had a chance." From the moment America entered the conflict, the outcome was inevitable. Weber wanted to argue, to defend the courage and skill of German soldiers, to insist that industrial capacity wasn't everything. But he couldn't. He had seen enough. The numbers were too large, the scale too overwhelming. Germany had gone to conflict with a nation that could build cities of steel in its heartland and barely notice the expense. The tour continued to a manufacturing plant on the west side, where the prisoners watched assembly lines producing refrigerators. Not weapons, not military equipment, refrigerators for civilian households. The line moved with hypnotic precision, each worker performing a specific task, machines stamping out identical parts, the finished products rolling off the line at a rate of hundreds per day. The plant manager, a cheerful man named Robert Harrison, explained that this was a small facility, that the company operated several larger plants. That demand for refrigerators had actually increased during the conflict years because civilian wages had risen so much. "Wages rose during the conflict?" Weber asked in disbelief. "Sure," Harrison replied. "Labor shortage. Everyone who wanted a job could get one, and companies competed for workers. My line workers here make more now than they did in 1941. It was too much to process." The nation had been engaged in a global conflict for nearly 4 years, had sent millions of men overseas, had produced weapons and supplies at a rate that boggled the imagination, and civilian living standards had improved. The buses returned to the loop for the final stop of the tour. The prisoners were taken to the top of the carbide and carbon building, a sleek Art Deco tower with a distinctive green terracotta facade. From the observation level, they could see the entire city spread before them, the grid of streets extending to the horizon, the density of buildings, the organized chaos of urban America. Sullivan pointed out landmarks. That's Comiskey Park, where the White Sox play baseball. That direction is the University of Chicago, one of the best research institutions in the world. Over there you can just see Gary, Indiana, more steel mills. And beyond that, you've got Milwaukee, another major city, about 90 miles north. Another major city, 90 miles away. And beyond that, more cities, more factories, more evidence of industrial capacity that simply could not be matched. Weber stood at the window for a long time, his breath fogging the glass. He thought about his diary entries, his confident assessments of American weakness and German superiority. He had been so certain. They all had been. The Americans were culturally unsophisticated, technologically lucky, militarily inexperienced. The conflict would eventually turn in Germany's favor because German soldiers were simply better. But none of that mattered when facing an enemy that could build what spread before him. Quality was irrelevant when confronting quantity of this magnitude. Courage meant nothing against production capacity that could replace every piece of equipment, every vehicle, every weapon faster than they could be destroyed. He pulled out his diary and wrote a new entry, his hand shaking slightly. We did not lose the conflict on the battlefield. We lost it here in the factories and rail yards and steel mills of a nation we never understood. They did not defeat us with superior tactics or better soldiers. They buried us in production, drowned us in capacity, overwhelmed us with resources we could not match. I have seen Chicago. I understand now why we could not win. The return journey to Camp Ellis was silent. The prisoners sat with their thoughts, processing what they had witnessed. Some, like Weber, accepted the implications immediately. Others, like Mueller, spent the train ride doing calculations, trying to find some flaw in their observations, some explanation that didn't require accepting the totality of their defeat. But the numbers didn't lie. If Chicago, one city, not even the largest, possessed this level of development, and if America had dozens of similar cities, then the aggregate production capacity exceeded anything Germany could hope to achieve. Even if every German citizen had worked every day of the conflict, producing nothing but military equipment, even if every factory had operated at perfect efficiency, even if every resource had been allocated with flawless planning, Germany still could not have matched American output. The implications extended beyond the immediate conflict. Richter realized that the architectural achievement they had witnessed represented more than just tall buildings. It represented an organizational capacity, a mastery of logistics and coordination that allowed such projects to be conceived, financed, designed and constructed by civilian entities without government direction. The freedom that Americans enjoyed, the ability to build newspapers that could commission Gothic towers, the ability to reverse rivers for civic improvement, the ability to produce refrigerators during global conflict, that freedom was itself a kind of power. Back at Camp Ellis, word of the excursion spread quickly through the prisoner population. Those who had gone to Chicago tried to explain what they had seen, but words failed them. How do you convey the sensation of standing beneath buildings that scraped the sky? How do you communicate the psychological impact of realizing your entire industrial base could fit in a single American city's manufacturing district? Weber's diary became a sought-after document. Other prisoners read his account, and many refused to believe it. They accused him of exaggeration, of falling for American propaganda, of betraying German pride. But those who had seen Chicago knew the truth. Some, like Weber and Richter, accepted it with something approaching relief. If the enemy was this powerful, then defeat carried no shame. Others, like Mueller, struggled with the cognitive dissonance of maintaining ideological certainty while acknowledging industrial reality. The camp officers organized more excursions, taking different groups to see American cities and factories. Each trip produced similar reactions. The prisoners returned subdued, thoughtful, forced to confront the gap between what they had believed about America and what actually existed. In February, Weber participated in a discussion group organized by the camp's education officer. The topic was post-conflict reconstruction, and the conversation turned to what Germany could learn from American methods. Weber surprised himself by engaging seriously with the question. A few months earlier, he would have dismissed the entire premise as insulting. Now, having seen Chicago's skyline, he recognized that Germany would need to adopt American organizational principles if it hoped to rebuild. "The buildings are impressive," he said during one session. "But what shocked me most was the casualness of it all. Americans don't seem to realize how extraordinary their achievement is. They built this civilization while barely paying attention, as though constructing cities of steel was the most natural thing in the world." Richter, sitting nearby, nodded. "That's the real difference. We approach everything with intensity and precision. They approach everything with abundance and flexibility. Both methods work, but their method scales better." The discussions continued throughout the winter and spring. As the conflict in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the prisoners at Camp Ellis grappled with their new understanding of the nation that had defeated them. Some held onto their previous beliefs, insisting that military skill and cultural superiority would ultimately prevail. But most, especially those who had seen Chicago, recognized that the post-conflict world would be shaped by industrial capacity and organizational ability, not military tradition or cultural refinement. Weber continued writing in his diary, documenting his transformation from confident officer to humbled observer. His final entry from this period, written in April 1945 as news of the conflict's end reached the camp, reflected his journey. "I came to America as a prisoner, expecting to find a primitive nation that had won through luck and numbers. I found instead a civilization that operates on principles we never understood. Their power comes not from military tradition, but from industrial capacity. Their strength lies not in disciplined precision, but in abundant flexibility. I do not know what kind of Germany will emerge from this conflict, but I know it must learn from what I have witnessed. The future belongs to nations that can build cities like Chicago, not to nations that dream of past glories." The prisoners at Camp Ellis eventually returned to Germany in 1946. Weber, Müller, Richter, and the others who had seen American cities carried home memories that would shape their perspectives for the rest of their lives. Some became advocates for reconstruction along American models. Others struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed with their previous beliefs. But none could unsee what they had observed. Weber particularly remembered the moment when he had stood at the window of the Carbide and Carbon building, looking out over Chicago's skyline, understanding with sudden clarity that his nation had challenged an industrial colossus while possessing only a fraction of its capacity. The courage of German soldiers, the skill of German engineers, the determination of German citizens, none of it had been enough against a nation that could build such cities and barely consider it remarkable. Years later, when asked about his time as a prisoner in America, Weber always returned to that day in Chicago. "They could have kept us in camps and told us nothing," he would say. "Instead, they showed us their cities. They wanted us to understand not just that we had been defeated, but why. It was the most effective psychological operation of the entire conflict. One look at Chicago's skyline did more to break German certainty than 4 years of battlefield defeats. We had been fighting an enemy we never understood, and when we finally saw the truth, we realized how fortunate we were that they chose to be merciful in victory." The educational excursions from Camp Ellis represented an unusual approach to handling prisoners during the conflict. By showing captured soldiers the industrial and architectural achievements of American civilization, the camp administrators aimed to demonstrate that resistance was futile and that post-conflict cooperation would be in everyone's interest. The strategy worked better than anyone anticipated. Prisoners who saw American cities return to their barracks transformed, their certainty shaken, their understanding of global power dynamics fundamentally altered. The impact extended beyond individual prisoners. When they returned to Germany, they carried stories of American abundance and capability that influenced reconstruction efforts. The German economic miracle of the 1950s owed something to this new understanding of industrial organization and production methods. Those who had seen Chicago remembered the lessons and applied them to rebuilding their homeland. The city of Chicago continued its development after the conflict, adding more towers to its skyline, expanding its industrial base, growing in population and economic importance. But for a brief period in 1945, it had served an unexpected role in global history, the city that broke the certainty of an enemy by simply existing, by demonstrating through its skyline and its streets that America possessed resources and capabilities that could not be matched through courage or skill alone. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.